Morning I woke up in that hospital bed. I didn't know what day it was. I didn't know how long I'd been out. What I did know was that the room was quiet, too quiet, and my daughter was nowhere to be found. Let me back up. My name's Leonard. Wait, no, I need to check that list. Give me a moment. I'll call myself Russell. Russell Hale, 64 years old, retired electrician out of Columbus, Ohio. 41 years I spent running wire through walls, climbing into attics in July heat, crawling under houses that smelled like mold and old insulation. My hands still look like it, knuckles like walnuts, palms that never quite got clean no matter how hard I scrubbed. My wife Carol passed 8 years ago, breast cancer. It took her fast. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, it was just me and my daughter, Nora, and her husband, Craig. Nora is 36. She grew up sweet. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest. She used to bring me coffee in the garage when I was working on the truck on Saturdays. She'd sit on an overturned bucket and just talk to me about school, about her friends, about nothing important. That was my favorite part of the week. Just that. Just her sitting there while I worked. Craig came along when Nora was 28. He sold pharmaceutical equipment. I never fully understood what that meant, but he wore good shoes and talked fast, and Nora seemed happy, so I kept my opinions to myself. They got married in a vineyard outside of Dayton. I danced with my daughter to What a Wonderful World. I cried, not ashamed of it. For a few years, things were fine. Then the calls started. The first time Nora asked me for money, it was for a car repair. Craig's Audi had transmission trouble and they were short that month. $3,000. I didn't hesitate. I transferred it the same afternoon. The second time was for their security deposit when they moved to a bigger apartment in Dublin, the nicer suburb north of Columbus. 5,000. Again, I didn't ask many questions. She was my daughter. Then it was a medical bill. Then it was Craig's sales territory had changed and his commissions were down. Then there was something about a business opportunity Craig was pursuing on the side, some kind of supplement distribution deal, and they needed startup capital. By Neptune, I added it up in my head. I had given them close to $60,000 over 4 years. Not loans exactly. I never drew up paperwork. I never charged interest. Every time I brought up repayment, Nora would get quiet, and Craig would pivot the conversation to something else, and I'd feel guilty for bringing it up at all, like I was being petty about money with my own child. My neighbor Darlene, 71 years old, retired school librarian, sharpest woman I know. She told me once, "Russell, you are not a bank, you are her father." I laughed it off. I told her Nora was going through a rough stretch and that it would level out. Darlene just looked at me over the fence the way she does. She didn't say another word. The accident happened on a Tuesday in November. I was driving home from the hardware store, maybe 2 miles from my house. It was late afternoon, already getting dark the way it does in Ohio in the fall, that gray, sunless kind of dark that settles in before 5 o'clock. I had a bag of weather stripping in the back seat. I was thinking about whether I had enough Cult to finish the garage windows before it got cold. I don't remember the impact. I remember the light changing, and then I remember sound, a horn, metal, something shattering, and then nothing, until I was in the ambulance and a paramedic was cutting my sleeve. I had 3 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and a concussion that kept me disoriented for the better part of 2 days. The other driver ran a red light. Not my fault. Doesn't make your ribs hurt any less. When I came around enough to understand where I was and what had happened, I asked the nurse about my daughter. She said someone had been called. I found out later it was Darlene who called her. Darlene had seen my name come up on the local emergency scanner app she downloaded after her own health scare 2 years ago. Nora arrived that evening. She came into the room and looked at me in the bed, tubes, monitors, the whole picture, and her face did something complicated, something I couldn't quite read. She asked me how I was feeling. I told her I'd been better. She managed a small laugh. Then she said, "Dad, this is going to be a whole thing, isn't it?" Not a question, a statement, said the way you talk about a scheduling conflict. I told her I was sorry for the inconvenience. She stayed maybe 40 minutes. Craig was waiting in the car. He had an early meeting, she explained. She squeezed my hand at the door and told me she'd check in tomorrow. She did not check in tomorrow. Or the day after. The woman who checked in on me was my nurse, a woman named Helen, 60-something, gray-streaked hair she kept in a braid, had a laugh that you could hear from down the hall. She'd stop in whenever she had a free moment, not just for clinical things, but to talk. She asked about Carol. She asked about my work, about whether I'd ever thought about going back to do light electrical consulting. She brought me a crossword puzzle book on the third day. "You look like a crossword man," she said. She was right. I lay in that bed for 5 days. 5 days of hospital food and bad television and the particular loneliness of a room with a window that looks out onto a parking garage. I called Nora twice. Both times it went to voicemail. She sent a text on the third day. "Thinking of you, Dad. Hope you're getting good care." I stared at that message for a long time. Helen noticed. Nurses notice everything, I think. They're trained to read a room. "Daughter?" she asked one morning, nodding at my phone on the tray table. "Yeah," I said. She didn't push. She just said, "Family's complicated," and refilled my water cup. On the fourth night, I couldn't sleep. My ribs ached if I shifted wrong and my mind wouldn't quiet down. I lay there in the dark thinking about $60,000, thinking about Nora at 7 years old bringing me coffee in a paper cup she poured herself, thinking about Carol, what Carol would have said about all of this. Carol would have said, "Russell, your kindness has a price, and you've been letting people pay it for you." Carol had a way of saying the true thing directly. By the time I was discharged on the 5th day, something had shifted in me. I can't explain it exactly. I wasn't angry, not in a hot way. It was more like clarity, like the accident had rattled something loose inside me that needed to come loose. Helen wanted me out. We exchanged numbers. I told her to let me know if she ever needed anything electrical looked at. Ceiling fans, outlets, whatever. She laughed. "I'll take you up on that," she said. I got home to a cold house and a mail slot stuffed with 5 days of envelopes. I fed myself a bowl of soup. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table Carol and I bought at an estate sale in 2003, scarred and solid, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my attorney, a man named Douglas Fitch, who had handled my will and my property documents since I first bought the house in 1998. "Russell," he said, "wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I need to come in," I said. "I need to look at some things." I went to see Douglas the following Monday. We went through everything: my will, my financial power of attorney, the beneficiary designations on my retirement accounts, and my life insurance policy. I'd made Nora the primary beneficiary on all of it when Carol died. It had seemed like the obvious thing to do. I made changes, careful ones. Douglas advised me well. I didn't cut Nora out entirely. She was still my daughter, and part of me still hoped. But I restructured things significantly. I added contingencies. I set up a small trust with Douglas as the co-trustee that would control how any inheritance was distributed and under what conditions. A spend-it-down provision to protect against certain behaviors. Douglas called it incentive-based inheritance architecture. I called it making sure no one could drain my estate while I was still breathing. I also, quietly, contacted my bank and removed Nora from the joint checking account I'd added her 2 years ago for emergency purposes. I moved my primary savings to a different institution entirely. I told no one, not Nora, not Craig, not even Darlene, though I came close with Darlene. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 11 days after I got home from the hospital, Nora and Craig came over on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced. Craig was wearing the look he always wore when he wanted something: pleasant, performatively casual, like a salesman warming up a room. Nora hugged me at the door. It lasted a second. They sat down at the kitchen table. Craig had printed something, actual printed papers, which he set in front of him like he was running a meeting. He talked for about 10 minutes. It took me most of those 10 minutes to understand what he was actually proposing because he used a lot of words to dress it up. The upshot was this: they had found a financial advisor, someone Craig knew from his sales network, who had advised them that with property values up, it made sense for me to sell the house, take the equity, and move somewhere smaller, an apartment or a senior community. They'd done the research. There was a place in Westerville looked nice. Craig had a brochure. The money from the sale, Craig explained, could be repositioned to work better for my retirement. He had a specific account in mind. I would benefit from the growth. So would Nora, eventually. I looked at the brochure. It had photographs of smiling people in their 70s playing bocce ball. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the table. "Nora," I said. She looked up. "Is this what you want?" She said, "Dad, we just think it makes sense. You don't need all this space. And the upkeep, we worry about you." I noticed she didn't answer my question. I picked up Craig's printed papers. I looked at them. Then I set them back down and folded my hands on the table and said calmly and clearly, "I'm not selling the house. I'm not moving to an apartment. I'm not repositioning anything." Craig started to say something about market timing. I held up a hand. "I'm also not sure," I said, "what financial advisor you're referring to, but any changes to my estate go through Douglas Fitch, who has been my attorney for 26 years. If anyone wants to discuss my finances, they can call Douglas." Craig's pleasant expression recalibrated slightly. He mentioned that they had also been looking into power of attorney, given my recent accident, just to make sure someone could act on my behalf if needed, for my protection. I said, "I had a concussion, Craig. My mind is fine, and I already have my documents in order. Douglas handled everything after the accident." Nora looked up sharply at that. "When did you go see Douglas?" "Last week," I said. "It's all taken care of." There was a long silence. I think they expected to come in here and find a shaken old man, still fragile from the hospital, grateful for the attention after 5 days alone, maybe a little muddled. I think they expected me to be soft, to be grateful that they had come at all. Craig asked if he could see the updated documents. I said no. He said he was just trying to understand my situation. I said my situation was none of his business. Nora said, "Dad, you're being defensive." I said, "I'm being clear, there's a difference." They left about 20 minutes later. Craig made one more attempt on his way out, something about just wanting what was best for me, and I told him I appreciated that and I'd be in touch through Douglas if anything came up. After the door closed, I stood in my kitchen for a while looking at the table. The soup I'd made earlier was still on the stove. I turned the burner back on and heated it up, and I sat down and ate. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was sitting in my own house. The weeks that followed were strange. Nora went quiet. No calls, no texts beyond a terse message, 3 days later saying she hoped I was feeling better and that she just wanted what was best for me. Craig sent one email, which I forwarded directly to Douglas without responding. I heard through a family friend, a woman named Bev who'd been close to Carol, that Nora had been telling people I'd changed after the accident, that the concussion had made me paranoid and difficult, that she was worried about me. Bev told me this over the phone gently because she thought I should know. I thanked her and asked her how her garden was doing. She laughed, a little surprised, and told me her tomatoes had been tremendous this year. We talked about tomatoes for 15 minutes. It was a good conversation. I spent those weeks going through things I'd been putting off for years. I cleaned out Carol's sewing room, finally, 8 years later, and donated what I thought she would have wanted, donated. I had Darlene over for dinner twice, and she brought a pie both times, because that's who Darlene is. I started doing some light consulting work through a former colleague, just a few jobs a week. It got me out of the house. It gave me something to think about, other than my daughter's silence. It was Darlene who finally asked me the question I've been carrying. We were sitting on my back porch one evening in late November, coffee cups going cold on the armrests, watching the last of the leaves come down from the oak tree Carol had planted in 1995. "Are you going to reach out to her?" Darlene asked. I thought about it. "Not yet," I said. "Are you going to forgive her?" I thought about that longer. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think I can love someone and still keep a clear distance. Those aren't contradictory." Darlene nodded slowly. "Your Carol used to say something like that." "I know," I said. "I got it from her." About 6 weeks after the Sunday visits, I sent Nora a letter, not an email. A letter, handwritten, 3 pages on the yellow legal pad I keep in my desk. I told her that I loved her. I told her I remembered every good thing about raising her and that those things hadn't changed. I told her that I also remembered every time I had given when I couldn't really afford to give, and how I had kept quiet about it because I loved her more than I loved my own comfort, and that I understood now that my silence had not served either of us well. I told her that I was not angry, and I meant it. I told her that I had put my finances in order and that they would remain in order, and that I had no intention of discussing them with her or Craig outside of a formal conversation with Douglas present. I told her that my house was my home and I intended to live in it for as long as I was physically able. And then I told her that I would leave the door open, that if she wanted to call, I would answer, that if she wanted to come over for dinner, I would cook, that the father she grew up with was still here. I hadn't gone anywhere, but that I was done letting love be used as a lever against me. I sealed it and mailed it on a Thursday. She called on Sunday morning. She cried. I let her. I didn't say a lot at first, just listened, which is something I wish I'd done more of over the years, actually listened instead of just writing a check and hoping things would work out. After a while, she said, I don't know when I became someone who would do that. I said, I don't know either, but I think you can find your way back from it. Craig was so sure it was the right move, she said. Craig's not your conscience, I said. Long pause. We talked for almost 2 hours. It wasn't resolved. I want to be honest with you about that, because the stories that tie everything up neatly in one phone call, I've never found those to be true to life. We didn't resolve anything in those 2 hours, but we talked in a way we hadn't talked in a long time, maybe years, maybe since before Carol died. She didn't come to me because I'd been weak or frightened. She came to me because I'd drawn a line. And there is something in people, I think, even when they've lost their way, that recognizes a line and understands, somewhere, what it means. Craig and I have not spoken since that Sunday afternoon in my kitchen. I don't know what the future holds there, and I've stopped trying to predict it. Nora and I have had dinner 3 times since the phone call. The first time was awkward. The second time was better. The third time she brought apple cider, and we sat at the kitchen table, Carol's table, and talked about nothing important for 2 hours, the way we used to when she was young and everything between us was still simple. I still have the house. I still have my savings intact. I still have Douglas looking out for the paperwork. And I have Darlene next door, bringing pie and telling me exactly what she thinks, which is probably the most valuable thing in my life right now. Helen, the nurse from the hospital, did call about that ceiling fan. I went over on a Wednesday and fixed it in 40 minutes. She made lunch. We've become something like friends the way people become friends later in life. Quickly, honestly, without a lot of pretense. I've been thinking about what I learned from all of this. And I keep coming back to one thing. Love doesn't require you to make yourself small. I spent years believing that being a good father meant never saying no, never drawing a line, absorbing whatever came at me so that Nora wouldn't feel any friction. What I was actually teaching her, I think, was that I had no edges, that I could be moved in any direction, that I was, in some fundamental way, a resource rather than a person. The accident shook something loose in me. Sometimes it takes that something sudden and out of nowhere, cold metal and broken glass, to remind you that your life is your own, and you have limited time to live it that way. I'm 64. My hands hurt in cold weather. I still make soup from scratch on Sundays. I still go to the hardware store more than I probably need to. I still sit at Carol's table and sometimes just put my hand flat on the surface and feel the grain of it, all the years soaked into the wood. I'm still here, still my own man. That's not a small thing. That's everything. I keep coming back to that kitchen table, Carol's table, the one we bought at an estate sale for $40 in 2003, because neither of us wanted to spend money on furniture when the mortgage was still new and the kids' college years were somewhere on the horizon. It's scarred and uneven, and one of the legs has a wobble I've been meaning to fix for 15 years. I keep coming back to it because that's where everything happened, where Craig laid out his printed papers, where I laid out mine, where Nora finally looked at me and started to understand what she'd been doing. What I've learned is that consequences are not punishment. They are simply the shape of what you built. For years I said yes when I meant no. I wrote checks when I should have asked questions. I stayed quiet when the quiet was costing me something real. I told myself that was love. What it actually was, I think, was avoidance. My own discomfort with friction dressed up as generosity, and Nora learned from that. Not the lesson I intended, but the lesson I taught. She learned that I would absorb whatever came at me. She learned that there was no edge to push against, so she stopped looking for one. That's not her fault entirely, and it's not mine entirely, but it is cause and effect as plain as anything I ever wired in 41 years of electrical work. You run current through a bad connection long enough, eventually something gives. The only question is whether you catch it before it burns something down. Douglas Fitch asked me once, after we'd finished revising the documents, whether I was at peace with the decisions I'd made. I told him I wasn't sure peace was the right word. What I felt was more like steadiness, the kind that comes not from having everything resolved, but from knowing where you actually stand. That steadiness, the willingness to look at a hard situation without flinching from it, to think it through clearly instead of reacting from fear or sentimentality, that took me longer to develop than it should have. I was a smart man in most rooms, but in my own house, with my own daughter, I kept choosing comfort over clarity for years. And then there's the matter of not giving up. Helen came to check on me when Nora didn't. Darlene brought pie and told me what she thought when I would have preferred a softer truth. Those weren't small things. Neither was the letter I wrote. 3 pages on a yellow legal pad. Honest in a way. I hadn't been honest in a long time. It would have been easier not to write it. It would have been easier to let the silence harden into something permanent. But I've lived long enough to know that the easier path has a way of becoming the lonelier one. I'm 64. My hands hurt when it's cold. I have dinner with my daughter now at Carol's table, and sometimes it's still awkward and sometimes it isn't. I'll take both. I'll take the whole complicated, imperfect thing because I'm still here to have it. That's not nothing. That's the whole point.